Uh, Good day, everyone. This is Mike Leibovitz. Apologies for the brief introduction there. Mike Leibovitz for On the Fly Wi-Fi. Certainly excited to speak today. I've got a great guest on board with us, a fellow named Dan Cybulski. Dan is a well-noted security professional in the wireless LAN space. Dan's been around for quite a long time covering security in particular. I know recently Dan was at Interop speaking on security topics, and certainly has been noted in a number of places and a delegate for Wireless Field Day. So Dan, why don't you say hi and thanks for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for having me. Hopefully we'll have a good discussion here. Oops, break my desk.
Hopefully you don't break your desk. So, I mean, I know you and I have talked before in the past about security, and there's so many topics in terms of security and what people are interested to hear about. Maybe we start with something simple before we go too technical. But you know, if you look at it from your perspective, what would you say is probably the biggest misconception with respect to wireless LAN security today?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably the biggest misconception dealing with customers and just dealing with people that I talk to at conferences is that wireless security, kind of as a puzzle, has been solved already. It's a lot of people still have to implement things, and they still have to find the budget for it, and they're still being told that they need to worry about it. But the thought is that if I spend the money, there is a perfect solution already in existence. The industry has already created it, and it's not something I need to worry about as long as I allocate the dollars. Probably the biggest misconception that I see.
So you think that most people just assume security is inherent, and it's interesting, right? Because Wi-Fi security, there's definitely the infrastructure, the network administrator, the challenges that they live in, or the world they live in, and then there's the end users that are challenged as well. But would you say that, I guess, the misconception is that people think that security is inherent and it's just automatically there?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to kind of paraphrase and generalize, I guess the statement you would hear is, well, if they're using it for businesses and it's out there, then they would have already had to figured out how to make it secure already, or we wouldn't be using it for business. It's kind of the thought process of the general end user and whatnot. So.
Interesting. So when you're out there talking to customers, and I know that you do a lot of consulting and implementation as well, what do you generally hear if someone says, you know, security's my big concern? And I know I've talked and certainly read a lot of different industry and analyst, you know, papers suggesting that, you know, security in general for IT, but Wi-Fi security in particular is a top concern, is where, you know, customers are spending money to secure their environment. When you speak to customers, what do you commonly hear as the big concern? You know, is it rogue APs, you know, soft APs, actual, you know, hackers that are trying to penetrate their Wi-Fi? What do you think what do you hear most commonly as like the top, you know, concern?
I guess I'll categorize them into two top. There's a tie, and it usually tells me where the conversation is going to go when I'm dealing with a potential client. I have some who honestly the big concern is my coverage leaking outside my building, and then okay, I've got to back up and go really really high level to start with this particular client, because if that's where we're starting the conversation, we've got a lot to talk about. Once we get past that, then we have kind of, I guess, another maturity level of customer, and usually the big concern for them would be more around, yeah, is somebody going to be able to get unauthorized access to my network? They're not worried about so much losing credentials or anything like that, or protecting their clients. They're concerned about unauthorized access via the wireless LAN.
Because I mean, do you still commonly see, I know years ago there was definitely a lot of rogue APs, and people have different terminology. I typically, you know, there's inside and outside perspective on what a rogue AP is, but a lot of people would classify a rogue AP as an access point that's physically connected to your wired LAN with an open SSID. It was something that was probably pretty common back before bring your own device proliferated and people were allowed to bring their own device in an authorized manner, do you still think do you still see customers that are concerned with rogue access points that are being physically plugged into the LAN, or do you think bring your own device, and certainly a segue into bring your own device conversation, has changed that sort of paradigm of the security that people are trying to?
Yeah, well, I think bring your own device has changed the narrative of the security industry around wireless in general. It's kind of we're people. We can only focus on so many things at a time, and that's the bigger topic to focus on, right? And it kind of goes to our point that we talked about at the beginning, is that a lot of people think the rogue AP thing is solved. I mean, you're not seeing wireless WIPS vendors. That's all they do anymore. I mean, WIPS is just built into your wireless infrastructure now. For the most part, there are some people who have just general overlays and whatnot. So people generally believe that that is solved. It's not really top of mind because they think they're already secured against it. But when I go in and I do assessments, well, I can't remember in recent history any time I've dropped in a rogue and been caught. It's not enough to buy something that has WIP, so you got the check mark. You actually have to configure it properly, which I think people don't. They assume it's configured by default because they bought it. It's configured and working, which isn't the case. So they should be worrying about it, but I don't find that they are worrying about it.
Yeah, I guess that's a couple good points. I mean, we can maybe come back to BYOD, but I guess in years past, dedicated wireless IPS or WIPS, as we typically refer to it as, has been kind of a typical way that a lot of environments would try to secure. So they'd overlay on top of their servicing APs, another set of access points in a dedicated manner to watch the airspace. It's kind of gone away. Certainly a lot of vendors offer that type of functionality in a servicing access point. So instead of the customer having to put 2 access points or some sort of ratio between a security access point and servicing access points, now people are generally looking at servicing APs. The question I would ask, is there enough security being fulfilled in a servicing access point? Is there too much of a trade-off? And I think it's interesting when you say, I've plugged in rogue APs and haven't been caught. Are people, again, going back to the misconception, assume that it's there? But is a dedicated overlay WIPS network still required in your opinion?
I don't think it's required. I mean, it's we're getting into a deeper kind of risk analysis type of conversation. I mean, if the cost of rogues occurring on your network on a yearly basis, the real cost, measured cost that is going to reoccur on a year-to-year basis, is high enough to justify the cost of an overlay, then yeah, it's warranted. But I think for most people, a dedicated overlay on top of what the infrastructure is providing is probably, from a budgetary standpoint, a little overkill and will probably be hard for them to justify to management at this point.
So in your estimation, so when you go into environments, do you typically try to run these attacks? I know you do some consulting as well, and you said, I never get caught with a rogue AP. Do you often try different hacker, whether it's denial of service or man in the middle type attacks? Do you typically get thwarted?
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of times I'm going on engagements where it's not so much a pen test as it's I don't know what you would call it, a security configuration review, where we're just kind of running through their config, making sure it's configured for best practice, and then testing things like alerts and what it notices. And in those cases, yeah, I'll plug in rogues and I'll leave them for the day. I'll connect, I'll surf through them, I'll do all kinds of fun stuff. I'll do a denial of service attack against a test client. So at this point, they're even aware of the client I'm going to attack, but they don't get any alerts. They don't. Nothing happens. And I usually, instead of just taking a screenshot, I'll take a Camtasia video capture of me doing the attack live, so I can show them, look, here I am attacking this client over and over again, and nobody came and tackled me. And I'll do evil twin attacks. I'll do all kinds of fun stuff. And usually, if you dig into their WIPS logs, you'll find a record of this happening. It's just there's no rule set up to look for that and alert anybody about it.
Do you think organizationally, I mean, it's interesting. I guess when you look at wireless LAN in general, and a lot of larger companies have maybe a dedicated wireless LAN group, and smaller companies, wireless LAN probably would be handled by the network team. But a lot of organizations put security in its own realm or in its own group, not necessarily part of the networking team. Do you think that there's, I guess, a broader problem of the wireless LAN group or wireless LAN administrator being forced to understand security maybe in a different way than a traditional switching or wired network administrator needs to be?
Yeah, well, I think when we're talking wireless, I think we can broaden that outside of just security. I mean, you're forced to think of networking in a different way in general, and the security on top of it when you're talking in a wireless world compared to a wired world. So I think, yeah, you've got to have someone who's specifically trained for a wireless network, who understands wired networking, but you've also got to have communication between the wired guys and the wireless guys, because a lot of the stuff is based on correlation of events, right? If I'm trying to isolate a rogue on the wired network and all I can see is the air, well, I'm never going to be able to tell if it's plugged into the wire, right? So if it's two different departments and one team has visibility onto the wire and one person wireless only, and you're not allowing them to communicate, or you haven't fostered that communication so they talk regularly and share information, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, security-wise.
Interesting. So I guess, when I keep thinking about the fact that so many, companies are investing or think that security is really at the forefront of their concerns. And even in your examples, you walk into, not necessarily do a penetration test, but maybe a configuration review, and things just aren't done right. Are organizations just too confused on what the topic is, or do you, again, tie it back to people just assume everything's automatically turned on? And then the question is, if that is the case, is there a different level of education that even the wireless LAN vendors should be taking to those customers to say, hey, there are things that you need to do, there are things you need to turn on to make the security operate?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of all those, but I mean, probably the number one is there is the confusion around what's already on the wireless network. I mean, even I remember blogging about how much more secure a wireless network was than a wired network. And that was a couple of years ago. Oh yeah, it's through wired, and wireless is the way to go, and it's more secure right out of the box and stuff. So even I blogged about it, but I mean, my assumption at the time was that it was all configured properly, right? So you get people like myself, I guess, adding to the problem, writing this stuff, but the people reading it maybe don't understand all the assumptions behind what's being written. So they assume it's all turned on. So when I go into these places, it's usually confusion around what's on, and I guess maybe the bigger piece of information to add to that is usually they have everything they need on their network somewhere. They just haven't tied their wireless system into it yet. So it's just educating them about, listen, this is what you have, and we can leverage all this stuff just in the wireless side, and you're ready to go. It's not like you need a big CapEx expenditure here.
It kind of reminds me of traditional wired IDS or IPS, if you will, where a lot of organizations put these boxes on their network, or have traditionally put these boxes on their network, not necessarily tuned or tweaked any signatures, just kind of check box and say, hey, this thing's on our network, so it must be secure. kind of seems like wireless IPS is a little bit down that path as well, that people just assume, hey, something must be happening in the background. Do you think that, and I guess to change gears for a second, bring your own device and consumerize products and all of these, kind of proliferation of devices and making the problem worse, really you're exasperating what's already perhaps a taxed IT shop and asking them to do more with less. Do you think BYOD has really changed the paradigm of security, or just added to it?
Well, I think, yeah, BYOD is an interesting thing, and I mean, we could talk for a long time on that because there's certain things that really annoy me about it. I mean, I think it's a good thing. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a good thing having mobile devices, but I think it causes us to glaze over important issues. So BYOD, initially, yeah, we start having all these devices in, or maybe just mobile devices, maybe not BYOD, they're owned assets. Initially, yeah, people were focused about, okay, how do I get credentials onto these things and how do I provision them and whatnot. But watching the industry, slowly the focus has changed to, we've got that solved, let's move on to all the awesome features we're now going to add, right? So we're going to provision all these extra settings, we're going to throw in advertising, we're going to throw in location awareness, we're going to throw all this stuff. So the focus is really changing, taking our focus off of security into all these extra things. We're looking at the prize and not what we need to do to get there anymore. So it's a bit of a problem. I don't think it's solved yet. I think we're close on BYOD and mobile devices, but there's some underlying issues that I have a problem with still.
Well, yeah, and it would be great to maybe drill into one or two of those underlying, but I think it's interesting even when you hear a lot about the Internet of Things and wearable devices, and most of these, I mean, they're not even necessarily consumerized devices. I mean, maybe, glasses or watches or these types of things are consumerized, but it certainly seems out of the box that most of these devices that are shipping, basic capabilities, client capabilities, run security, which I think is, and certainly interested in your opinion on it, but I think it's going to further challenge securing an environment where now sensors and machines and watches and all these things can do basic security if they're lucky, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, someone, I can't remember who blogged about it. Actually, I think I can, but I'm not going to mention his name in case he doesn't want to mention. He wrote an interesting piece about how manufacturers need to just assume that their devices are going to end up in a business now. We're past the point that we can assume that I've got different classes of device and there's such thing as a consumer device and there's an enterprise device. That's been blown away. You should be assuming when you're manufacturing these things, as far as I'm concerned, and it's easy for me to say because I'm not manufacturing them, that these devices are going to end up on an enterprise, so I need to build them accordingly and add in functionality accordingly.
Yeah, it's funny because there's kind of always been this sort of it's the infrastructure's problem or it's the client's problem. Users don't care, right? People, as we bring our devices, whether it's an iPhone or a tablet or a watch or glasses, we just expect things to work. And it's interesting because I guess most people assume, going back again to this misconception that security is inherent, it's been in the news a lot recently is open Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi, and trying to expose the fact that, on an unencrypted, session, you really are subject to whatever is going on around you. Interested in your thoughts on that, whether it's overhyped or overblown, and maybe even recommendations for people when they're in a hotel or when they're in an airport or coffee shop. Do we use open SSIDs? Do we stay away from them?
That's a tough one. I mean, I don't think anybody in their right mind would think they're gonna tell people don't use open Wi-Fi, don't use that coffee shop, and expect people to listen to them. I mean, we're a connected culture now, whether we agree that we should be or not, and people are going to use it. So I mean, it's incumbent upon us as consultants, vendors, the industry in general, to come up with easy to digest ways of making those connections secure. So I mean, if I look at my iPhone, I can VPN and tunnel all my traffic, but I need to have some kind of VPN concentrator on the back end, or I need to subscribe to a service, and I need to turn it on all the time. My device goes to sleep, and then I've got to go back in and turn the VPN. Now, I happen to have a VPN concentrator, but I'm a bit of a freak, right? So most people aren't going to have this. Yeah, so I mean, that's a tough one to solve. I don't know of a way to tell people this is what you need to do to make your connection secure and be happy knowing that your data is all secure when you're out using public Wi-Fi. I mean, it's kind of again a risk assessment thing that people have to come to terms with. These are the risks, and we can educate you of the risks, and then if you're aware of them, then for now you've got to either accept them or decide not to use it. But most people are going to use it.
So knowing what you know about Wi-Fi and layer one, layer two, WIPs and all the security that's capable of, do you think that what we're seeing in the press right now in terms of open Wi-Fi and its vulnerabilities is overhyped or spot on?
Um, I think it's I think it's probably spot on for what's possible out there. I think obviously they add a little dramatics to to it. They are the media, so I mean they make it a little bit more dramatic. But I mean, yeah, they're not saying anything that isn't possible. Is it as prevalent? I don't know. That's a tough one to say. I guess that's a regional question, and people will probably sit down and debate that for a very long time. How often it actually happens, but I mean, I'm sure everybody knows at least someone who's had something happen. I mean, I know people that I work with have had something happen when they're on open Wi-Fi, and they've had to go back and change their Facebook accounts and all kinds of good stuff. I mean, it does happen. How often it happens, maybe the media overhypes that part.
Yeah, and I guess part of it goes back to the MDM and BYOD conversation when your employees or your users are taking I don't want to say consumerized, but their own device, whatever that device is, and they're bringing it to the office, and then they're bringing it to the airport, and then they're bringing it to a coffee shop and back to the office. MDM. I know some people look at it and say, it's a little bit draconian. It's a little bit, too focused on certain healthcare, on certain verticals like healthcare, for example, where it makes sense to protect the data.
Mm-hmm.
How do you really, bind that world where, on one hand, your users are coming into the organization with their device, and on the other hand, they're taking that device wherever they go. Do you simply just not allow them to access, corporate or sensitive data on their personal device and say, at that point, then I don't care? And is that even realistic?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if it's realistic with what we've got today. I mean, there are containerization solutions out there now that I don't know how well they work. I honestly haven't played around with them that much because I find there's just so many of them. I don't even know how to weed through them all, right? So I mean, and then you get locked down to just certain apps that work within those containers. So I don't think it's actually there yet where it's a nice easy solution that we can do that and say, you know what, let's give our devices to people and we can lock out all the business side. I mean, you've got to have security on the client, but you've also still got to have security mechanisms back to where your data resides. So I think there's two parts to the equation that have to be looked at.
Do you think that MDM is, I don't want to say overhyped, but maybe in a way overhyped that some organizations just don't think about it or discredit it and say, I can secure my infrastructure and I can protect the assets, my data while people are using my Wi-Fi network or my wired infrastructure for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, in your opinion, do you think MDM is a mandatory element if you had your perfect world scenario, or it really only fits certain scenarios for certain types of customers?
Yeah, I guess if I had a perfect world, yeah, I would say some kind of MDM that had a containerization solution that actually worked well and adjusted as technology adjusted and new products came out quickly, I think would be a good mandatory thing. But I don't know if that's realistic to say at this point. I don't know if that exists right now.
So, I guess the switch gears for a minute, maybe as we start to wrap up the conversation. But from your perspective, when you're embarking in a conversation with a new customer, even if they have an existing wireless LAN, what is the best advice that you normally give if someone said, there's one thing, if there was one thing that you can do to secure a network, and I don't even know if that's realistic, but how do you typically advise customers in terms of what to think about, and if there was one thing top of mind that you would say to everybody broadly, hey, here's a real consideration, here's something that you need to think about?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I would say probably the best suggestion I would get that would get you the most mileage for what you can accomplish with it would be pay more attention to your clients. I mean, security people generally focus on the infrastructure, and maybe that was good in a wired world, but in a wireless world, even when we're just talking connectivity decisions, and certainly security decisions, the client has a lot more say in what's happening, and by client I mean the device. So pay more attention to your clients and how they're configured, I would say, would be where you can get the most bang for your buck.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, I certainly appreciate your time today, Dan. I know that you're a well-respected individual, and again, I appreciate your time to come on this episode today and spend a little time chatting. Hopefully the viewers caught some good advice, and I guess the two takeaways in my mind, thinking about maybe even the next blog entry for me, is kind of the misconception that people think things are secured, and you got to look at your clients as much, if not more, than the infrastructure itself.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
With that, I'll sign us off, and again, thank you for your time, Dan.
All right, take care.